On the bench, I have a Pentax MZ3 with new parts installed and ready for reassembly. Most of this reassembly is going to be simply doing it in reverse, but there are a couple steps where it's necessary to make sure things are set in a certain way to ensure proper coupling. For example, when I finished the mirror box repair, I had to set everything back to its home position, which is indicated by this hole in the yellow gear appearing in that window. Another thing I need to check before reinstalling the mirror box is the state of the shutter. The charge lever for the shutter sticks out from under that green circuit board, and if the tab is down towards the bottom of the camera as it is here, then the shutter's not charged. So I'm just going to hook the little tab and pull it up till it clicks. Now the shutter is charged, the mirror box is in its home position, and all the levers and bits and things will couple properly when it's installed. But besides the occasional bit of wisdom from the service manual, this video is going to be pretty straightforward. The fun exploration of disassembly is over now, and I just need to get it back together. Instead of commenting on all of the fairly obvious procedures here, I'm going to use this video as kind of a catch-all for any miscellaneous thoughts I have about the repair or the MZ3 in general. A lot of the reassembly is just paying careful attention to wire routing and flex cable routing and making sure nothing is getting pinched where it shouldn't be. Especially during this step, there are bits and pieces hanging off all over the place, and they all need to be clear when the mirror box goes back in. So I've mentioned it a couple times in this series, but I feel like I need to give an official recommendation for the iFixit page for this camera. There's a lot of really good information over there. I may be a little bit biased because I wrote like 90% of it, but yeah, it's pretty nice. You'll even find stuff that isn't mentioned in the videos, like a body panel may be attached by several screws of different lengths, and the guide will tell you exactly where the short ones go and where the long ones go. It also details how to take off the bottom plate of the camera, which is an alternate method for removing the mirror box. And there's even a comment system available, so if you have a question about a specific step in the repair, you can leave a comment and get some help. Yeah, iFixit is a pretty cool place. You may have noticed that the camera on iFixit is not actually an MZ3, but a ZX-5n. So I guess now is a good time to run down exactly what the differences are from model to model and how the repair may vary. First, about the prefix, MZ and ZX cameras are the same thing. The ZX prefix was used in the North American market, while everywhere else used the MZ prefix. So a ZX-5n and an MZ-5n are the same camera, just released in different regions of the world. The MZ3 is a slightly upgraded MZ-5n. The only difference that I'm aware of is that the MZ3 has a top shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second instead of 1/2000th of a second. Otherwise, they're identical, and the repair procedure, the replacement parts, all that is the same. Except the shutter. I don't think you can swap shutters between cameras. I was a little intimidated by the flex cables when I first started working on these cameras, but they're really not that bad. To prepare it, I first tinned the lower flex cable with new solder, and then I put the top flex in position using the mounting posts, which are hugely helpful in aligning the pads and holding everything in place. At this point, I can start reflowing the solder to make the connection. I heat the pad of the top flex cable, which draws the solder across the gap, making a complete connection, and also push down gently with my tweezers. After all the connections are made, I go back and touch up the joints, add solder where necessary, and break any shorts between pins. There are also a lot of other MZ series cameras. The MZ5, the MZ6, the MZ7 are all pretty nice cameras. The 5 uses the same classic dial-based control scheme, but the 6 and 7 use a more modern mode-based control scheme. If you want a smaller autofocus body, but are not as enamored as I am by a cool shutter speed dial, these are still great options. As far as the repair goes, it's still roughly the same. Taking the body panels off is a little different, and there are more flex cables to deal with, but the core mechanicals of the camera are the same, and all the parts that I put into this MZ3 could be put into an MZ6. I should make one point about this next step in the assembly. I'm about to put the main flex circuit back down. First, I'm gathering all of the wires and making sure that they're neatly bundled and all coming out in one spot. And to get this flex back in place, there is one critical locator tucked underneath here, right there. If we get that post on the plastic carrier inserted into the hole in the aperture control plate, which is that metal bit there, everything else should fall into place. Okay, back to camera talk. The MZM, or the ZXM, is also worth a mention. I think it was meant to be kind of a student cam, a back to basics cam, the successor to the K1000. It has controls similar to an MZ3, but it's manual focus only, hence the M. I don't love this camera. I put up with the plasticky build quality because of all the great features these cameras have, like a spot meter and autofocus and TTL flash. When you strip all that out, you're left with the functionality of a K1000, but without any of the charm. There is one good use for the MZM though, and that's the split prism focusing screen. I like a good split prism, even on an autofocus body. So I took the screen out of a dead MZM that I had and put it in my MZ3. Looks great, do recommend. As I'm rewiring all these connections, I try to keep an eye on the quality of the joint. If I see solder that isn't flowing well, if it's peaking and not forming a nice little ball, then I'll add some flux to help it out. This is usually only an issue when I'm reusing the solder from the original connection. If I'm laying down new solder, the flux embedded in the core keeps everything nice and smooth. But soldering is still not something I have a ton of experience with, so if you have any tips for me, I'm always looking for ways to improve. Besides the basic focusing screen swap, I have made some other modifications to my personal MZ3. Like, I really hate dial locks. Having to push the button to turn the exposure compensation feels so clunky. And these dials already have pretty firm clicks, and I'm not really worried about them getting knocked out of place. So I disassembled the knobs, found the little plastic locking tab, and snipped it off. No more dial locks. Now I have a lot of replacement parts, so if I wanted to reverse this mod, I could do it. If you wanted to disable the dial locks without making that kind of permanent modification, you can just remove the plastic piece altogether. The little lock button may sag a bit more and not look quite the same, but it'll get the job done. I've also done some more adventurous hacking on a parts camera I have. The first thing I tried was rewiring the panorama switch into a double exposure switch. It didn't work. I went with the simplest possible approach, which was to use the switch to turn off the motor that advances the film. Ideally, the camera would fire the shutter and then just leave the film in place, ready for the second exposure. But the camera is a little too smart for its own good, and it threw an error when the motor didn't run. Oh well. The flex for the flash connection is a bit tricky. Unlike the previous flex, which had mounting posts to aid in alignment, the flex for the top cover is free-floating. So my strategy here is to hold it in place as well as I can, try and get all of the pads lined up, and then tack a couple of them in place, just enough to hold everything. And then I come back with the tweezers and make all the rest of the connections. It usually goes pretty well, but it can definitely get fiddly. Another idea I had for a camera mod was to figure out some way of creating back button focusing. The autofocus on the MZ3 is very capable, but it's obviously not at the level of modern cameras. It's the kind of autofocus that you want to use to quickly dial in a focus point, but not the kind of autofocus that can easily track a subject from shot to shot, if that makes sense. I think removing the AF on functionality from the shutter release and putting it on its own dedicated button would fit the camera's capabilities much better. But the main hurdle here is not rewiring the connections, it's the release priority that's baked into the camera. The MZ3 will only fire the shutter if it has achieved focus lock. And this is very natural when you are autofocusing on the half press, because the focus will lock before each shutter release. But with back button focusing, you generally want the camera to prioritize the shutter release, not the autofocus point. If you focus, release the AF on button, and then recompose, the camera won't fire because it won't have focus lock. So I'm still working this one over in my head, trying to figure out a good solution. So I repair both fully mechanical and heavily electronic cameras, and I enjoy both of them for different reasons. Like with this camera, this is gonna sound weird, but the electronics actually simplify a lot of the assembly and make it easier. In a mechanical camera, every time you put something back together, you have to check if it's coupled and synced properly, and that the action is correct, and that the bias spring is on the right side of the post, and so on and so on. Like on the Pentax MX, when you put the mirror box back in the body, you have to make sure that this little set of gears near the prism has meshed properly, so that the shutter speed displayed in the viewfinder matches the shutter speed selected on the dial. And sometimes it's a little too high or a little too low, and then you adjust this eccentric screw to center it. It's very fiddly, and there's lots of other points like this in the camera. But in the MZ3, all this coupling happens electronically. You just solder a couple wires and the shutter speed dial can talk to the viewfinder display. That's what I'm talking about. To me, the mental load to reassemble an MZ3 is much lower than it is to reassemble an MX. If you cast your mind back to the initial disassembly of this camera, you may recall that I broke a piece off of one of the body panels. Here's the original, and here's the replacement part from another camera. You can see the little tab that's missing. It slides up under the lens mount panel and serves as an additional attachment point. The flip side of the mechanical versus electronic issue is that it's much harder to troubleshoot an electronic camera. If the shutter in this camera is malfunctioning, I can't take everything apart, isolate the shutter, and try and see what's wrong with it. The camera has to be completely assembled for me to fire the shutter. Professional camera techs back in the day may have had specialized test units that could do this, but those aren't really available today, and certainly not to an amateur like me. So when I work on a camera like this, I can do some basic checking, but I really don't know if the repair worked fully until I reassemble the whole thing and drop in some batteries, which makes moments like this pretty loaded. All right, that's what I like to see. I'll run through just a few of the basic settings here to make sure all of the controls are working. Okay, continuous mode. Yep. How about the flash? Uh-huh. All right, this is looking good. I'll pop a lens on to check the function of the aperture. Also, look at this little thing. The 43mm limited is hands down my favorite lens to use with this camera. What a package. And yep, aperture is looking good. I think I've got myself a happy and healthy camera. Of course, the ultimate test is a roll of film, and I'll make sure to do that before I declare total victory, but the outlook is favorable. Hopefully you enjoyed this video series and learned a little bit about the Pentax MZ3. The next camera on my schedule is a Pentax K1000, so make sure to check back in and see something from the other end of the technological spectrum. See you then.